Hey guys, here's part 2 of 3 of Dr. William Lane Craig's 9 arguments for theism. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, and I see a theme going through all of these arguments quite well of God's intentionality. He is behind every decision made, behind the pain, behind the suffering, what was intended, as is mentioned in Genesis, what was intended against me for evil, God has meant for good. And like you were mentioning earlier, some evils that God allows for a more maximally good outcome. It appears that God has been working behind all of these happenings to bring about that good and perfect ending, or continuation rather than ending.
No, I love that, man. Yeah, it's a good lead into that next argument. So far, we're looking at the Kalam cosmological argument. We're looking at the contingency argument. We're looking at the ontological argument, and particularly ontology suggesting that there's this maximally great being that exists. And intentionality frames the discussion in terms of why is it necessary that God be personal? Why is it necessary that God be a person? Could it be just a force? Could it be an abstracted series of interconnecting realities? More on those as we talk a little bit more. But see, personhood and identity, we see this as an attempt to reconcile the one and the many in the unity and diversity paradox. I know it's an idea I've mentioned before in previous casts, but it's one that actually I think is so necessary for the evangelist, the person who speaks to apologetics to really understand, because this is a paradox and a philosophical idea that is needs to be understood and made sense of in any worldview. So the one and the many idea is basically, is reality one in essence, or is reality many in essence? Is reality unified in essence, or is a reality diverse in essence? If reality is one, things like sin, things like ego and self and will wouldn't be possible. If reality was many, well, then we wouldn't have, where would be the actual sense of cohesion? Where would be the sense of unity? Where would be the sense of really being able to know the other and really be able to actually understand someone else's point of view? How would truth cohere and connect? How would truth be contingent? We actually see that Trinitarian theology actually resolves this tension, because even within God himself, he is us. There is one God, but there's three persons. There is one God, but a reality of relationship and community within God himself. It's actually, a good resolution to people actually suggesting, well, did God create humanity because he was lonely? Well, if we go off Trinitarian theology, no, he was sufficiently happy within himself for all of timeless past, because within himself he found all the needs for intimacy and connection that relationship offers that he would have otherwise needed. But he still desired to create creation and the Imago Dei nonetheless. Even humanity itself is a reflection of that Trinity. We are body, mind, and soul. Right now, we are two or three gathered. We are two people talking, having the possibility of knowing each other. But the Holy Spirit in each of us actually, that distinction, but also that unity, offers the possibility of truly knowing one another in a way that just isn't possible outside of other religions. But slight digression, we're still talking general theism, not specifically Christian theism. Intentionality, if God does not exist, intentional states of consciousness would not exist. Again, theistically, and particularly Christian theism, talks about the idea of Imago Dei, and the Imago Dei, being made in the image of God, means that we have sentience and self-awareness, that we understand ourselves as distinct from others, that we have morality and ethics, that we have creativity in terms of recreation, procreation, that we have the will and we have the ability to think and to rationalize logically, deduce, and we have the awareness of absolutes or transcendence. See, all of this makes sense if there is, again, outside ourselves, some transcendent personal creator outside of ourselves and outside of our existence. I think it's why it's interesting that actually you've got the Eastern and the naturalistic, even, probably more recently in the 21st century, this progressive Christian alternative, which actually talks about the annihilationism of the self, the actual need to get rid of the self.
Yeah.
I actually think that's an anti-biblical idea, because actually God is, in resolving the tension of the one and the many, he wants us to be one, but he also wants us to be our distinct selves as well, just as God himself is both one and many. Sorry, did you want to say something there?
No, I was just that had me thinking about, you're right, that is in opposition to the panentheist or progressive kind of approach to things, and that reminds me of your earlier point when you were talking about the contingency of God, that there has to be a distinction from creation, and because of that there is holiness or otherness, like you were saying, that there is that separation from his creation, yet he is still able to be a part of it. And that's something that I think we were talking about in our cast on progressive theology, that
exactly
there is a possibility of that within even interdimensional understandings of physics.
No, I love that, because it's like, just as, slight side point, like, faith and science, for example, people say like, oh, they're irreconcilable. Probably not so much in this generation, but certainly when I was growing up and, studying apologetics, that was a big point of discussion.
Yeah.
But in terms of those two coming together, in terms of actually truth being contingent, they should be able to cohere. They should be able to find unity. They shouldn't actually be disparate truths. They should actually be able to explain the same things. So yeah, like in terms of, say, interdimensionality or even metaphysics, we would say that as Christian theists, like, those two shouldn't contradict each other. They should be both tautological. They should be actually both simultaneously true, right? And again, thinking about the burden of proof, we actually think about the naturalistic alternative. I have a series of points here. The naturalistic alternative to intentionality is that compounding exponential statistics are the chances that we are. We're talking about, billions of years and a series of just so ideal circumstances accounting for just the reality as is and making it just so. The naturalistic alternative is that ideal life circumstances were made possible by infinitesimal odds. The naturalistic alternative is that the universe must be billions of years old to accommodate for this. See, that's a point that isn't often considered, right? That actually the age of the universe has to be as old as it is to allow for evolution, macroevolution, to make sense. More on that a little bit later. But the naturalistic alternative, again, is that life has never been documented to come from non-life. Makes me wonder, actually, is this why this kind of current hybridism of like this Buddhist naturalist religion has actually come in the present age in New Ageism, right? That everything is life. You've got the naturalistic alternative that radiocarbon dating and cosmic cooling is actually considered too short to account for the apparent complexity of the universe, the apparent complexity just of life on Earth. The naturalistic alternative is that mutation has to allow for macroevolution, but the only mutation ever documented has only ever been deleterious or corrupting, never positive, never positive results producing ideal circumstances. The naturalistic alternative, I'm reminded of The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. He spoke with a microbiologist about there was an experiment done in the 1970s to reverse engineer a DNA molecule. So basically they said, like, okay, here's the primordial soup with all the amino acids, and we're going to try and put it under a similar set of circumstances, like, electricity's charging, maybe from a Tesla circuit, so it's like lightning in the atmosphere, relatively the same amount of like oxygen to water ratio, closed environment, closed system.
Yeah.
The closest they were able to come to actually create a working DNA molecule was a series of Gattaca combinations that combined in the reverse order. And so therefore it was useless as a DNA molecule. It
basically created a formaldehyde-esque
yes.
Protein killer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. And this being an example, it's like, well, they would perhaps scientists would suggest like, well, obviously, we could repeat the experiment, different circumstances, and we just don't have access to the sources yet. But I feel like an Occam's razor argument kind of like rings bells here. Like, it's like maybe the simpler argument is actually the better explanation. Maybe the one that it's actually making more sense logically is the better argument. Another example, actually thinking about the naturalistic alternative to intentionality, again, reframing the discussion of God does not exist, intentional states of consciousness would not exist. In one of my top 5 favorite books, which I've mentioned previously on this cast, Nancey Pearcey, in her book Total Truth, talks about the biological idea of self as explained by macroevolution, as explained by naturalism. She even quotes the likes of like Steven Pinker, who's quite a intellect, of some repute in the States in terms of naturalistic thinking and atheistic thinking. He actually advances this idea that actually the naturalistic self is actually a convenient fiction, that there's no basis in biochemistry to actually believe that there is a sentient self. It's just something that the brain apparently fools itself into believing that you are a thing. It's just this conglomeration of cells has come together, and it's just like, oh, we'll trick the brain into thinking that self because it's evolutionarily advantageous. And it's just like, It seems like such a stretch to just justify something that's like, it seems more simpler to say, well, the self makes sense because a personal creator is a self themselves and would then actually create a self.
It reminds me, somewhat side note and not quite related, but that reminds me of that video that you and I were talking about not too long ago that was made by The Onion, the satirical news network, and it was scientists teach gorilla that he will one day die. And the gorilla becomes, it just falls into an existential depression.
Yeah.
And it signs, me have no hope, as, like you say, that there's no biochemistry available, no explanation for the self, and there are some attempts to come at that through various evolutionary psychological approaches, but I personally find them quite unsatisfying, and I always like the point that's made in a flashback in Breaking Bad, where Walter White is back in his college days with his old friend Gretchen, and they're working out the exact percentages of what we as humans are made up out of, what percentage of oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, or what we have, and then there's a missing 0.003 some, I don't know, and Walt's like, so what's missing? And she says, maybe it's the soul. And it's kind of like, well, possibly.
Possibly.
We haven't cracked it yet. We might one day, but yeah, it just reminds me of that. Sorry for the side tangent, but yeah.
I love that. No, that's brilliant. Like, I remember like doing biology in year 13 at school, and I did a research project on stem cell research. But one of the books I came across like actually really presented me with the idea of, so it's based on the fact that actually your cells actually in your body go entirely through a cell cycle every 7 years. So like you could technically say that you aren't the same you were 7 years ago, because from a biological point of view, that's actually true. There will be no existing cells that were you from 7 years ago, because your entire body would have recycled what it was. And so that actually really, like, even back then, like, presented me with the idea of like, so what is us? If we're intentionally, if we're just biological, what is the thing that actually unifies that together?
Yeah.
The naturalist doesn't really have an explanation to that. Like, what's to say that you are the same person you were 7 years ago? The biologist could be justified in actually saying, well, you're not.
Yeah.
But I would actually say, well, the theist would actually say, in a mind, body, spirit as an integrated whole, and none of those things actually separate, this actually resolves this apparent dichotomy.
Yeah.
Some people have advanced, when we talk about intentional states of being, this idea of actually maybe reality was created by abstracted mathematical realities, like by computers. Maybe the reality is a simulation idea is popularized on the back of this, right? But this would come back again to the idea of, why are we sentient? For us to exist as impossibly complex states of being as we are, there has to be a first cause that is sufficiently and exponentially more complex than us to make us even possible. And therefore, I would suggest it stands to reason that God must exist, and with some conceivable parallels to ourselves, in terms of states of intentionality. So again, some theorists suppose that if the being that created us were non-personal, say an abstracted series of mathematical workings and forces, that this could explain things and resultingly make sense of issues we otherwise struggle with epistemically, such as relativism of morals, origin of our complexity. But it runs into the problem of logically where our personal states of being come from. There's sufficient complexity as produced by something non-personal, and how all of the processes by which we came to be could be a product of happy coincidence rather than agency and intelligent design. And so there, for that reason, I prefer to believe in a creator, as it's far more rational logically. This is an idea that's not, dissimilar with scripture, like we've said. Even as far back and as early as Genesis 1 verse 26, you've got God saying, let us make man in our image. It's where we get the famous Imago Dei idea from. But, it doesn't say let I create man in our image. It says, even in the Hebrew, originally, us. So it's a hearkening to the God as Trinity idea, even as early in Genesis. So on our fifth argument, we have here, this is the idea that actually the mathematical argument, if God did not exist, the applicability of mathematics and absolutes would be a happy coincidence. So mathematical and scientific laws suggest the idea of design, sophistication and complexity, and the level of detail speaks of computation. So like these principles, boundaries, and limits require agency and sentience to be manipulated meaningfully towards predetermined ends or goals. I think that there are too many close shaves cosmologically for these forces to be blindly attributed to, as Craig puts it, happy coincidence. Mathematics evidence order, which suggests design and not randomness. One example that might help elaborate on this is the human genome. Within the most rudimentary components of our human bodies is a complexity that far surpasses the capacity, the capability of most human created technologies. And I'm not even talking about individual cells, which act like advanced supercomputers with an efficiency that outstrips most of our most impressive human factories. The DNA helix, which occurs in every single cell in our bodies, evidence a computer coding language which is exponentially more sophisticated and therefore more powerful than any human equivalent made. Scientists have still not even scratched the surface of understanding the interconnecting patterns and coding complexes that make humans exactly as they are. They understand that it works, they don't understand even the beginnings of how it works. At our most basic levels, our bodies evidence a sophistication which is unrivaled in all the earth in humanity's endeavors. These mathematical realities are relied upon implicitly and without sentient assent, moment by moment. Our bodies, this interconnecting microcosm of life, ensuring our survival. And I think, like, further on that point, you've got people in various academic disciplines, theists and atheists, like, devote themselves entirely to the discipline and study of just like some of such of the forces. And they find our world relies upon the immutability and continuity of these scientific and mathematical laws. The fact that such limits and laws and delineations govern our very creation, the earth, the cosmos, the chronos, the universe, this appeals to absolutes. I mentioned before Proverbs 8 and this poetic description of personification of wisdom in scripture. This conveys to us the unity and the order of these beautiful numbers, their symmetry, the balance and the inner workings. Mathematics has often been referred to as the language of God for many reasons, but chiefly as it applies here, because there is no gray or relative area in mathematics. There's got to be a precision, there's got to be an accuracy, there's got to be an exactitude. The way in which we come to a particular mathematical truth may vary. The answers are, for the purposes of reliability, they have to be black and white with very rarely little or, if not more than often, no room for variation. And if something is found to be wrong, it's often thought that it's the input, it's the person who's actually trying to do the working out, not the actual maths itself. If our world existed on postmodern ideas of truth, we simply couldn't exist. Imagine gravity being relative, or life or entropy being relative, or the oxygen ratio on the earth being relative. Such things could not be to sustain our lives. The forces governed, they may be subject and relative to circumstance, but the limits and laws by which they operate are absolute. And this appeals to design and to divinity. I know, like, something Caleb might advance here is this idea that actually, could the applicability be random or chance? You know, what are the chances of this? But I would probably say back, does the statistics logically make sense? More sense to be random, or do they make more sense to be personally directed?
Well, I guess I'm not sure exactly if it quite works, and this is possibly more of a counter for the fine tuning than anything else, which is the next point. So we won't. But either way, I think who's to say that the mathematical probability of these things is so unlikely in an infinitely expanding universe? Do we know what the possibility of things happening like this elsewhere in another galaxy or another part of our current galaxy are? That's a question that I've come across that I do find hard to answer. I've looked into it a little bit myself, but yeah, I think that would be something that is a bit of a difficult one to answer. Is how do we know that there isn't life elsewhere, and if so, is that life sentient? If so, what does that mean for us and our sentience?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we want to do a podcast in the future perhaps talking about sociology. Shout out to Gareth Davies and your request on our Facebook page. I would love to explore the possibilities of atonement, what that looks like if we aren't the only sentient creatures in the universe. I mean, we aren't if we accept angelology and demonology, which I think most believing Christians would.
Yeah.
So there is sentience in that respect. But yeah, that's actually a good point to consider in terms of absolutes applying in those instances, and does it mean something different sociologically? But I think in terms of the mathematical, in terms of governing laws that govern existence, I'd probably harken back to some of the I know Chuck Missler used to popularize this idea about the order of the universe, and actually this idea that from a mathematical standpoint, it's like, could God have created a different kind of universe that had different rules by which it governed? He could have, but this is the universe that he's created, and it would make sense that it would be consistent throughout. It couldn't be, some cases are this like this here, and other cases are like this here. Talking about, say, for example, universal constants like the speed of light, or the gravity constant. These are things that actually have to be consistent throughout the universe, and if they are different in some places, there are explanations for those differences, even if they actually haven't been worked out yet.
Definitely. And I like that as we're discovering more about it, it appears that, I think it was Chuck Missler put it quite beautifully, that mathematics is God's language of the universe. It's how he explains the universe, and how it works. And as we discover more about it, it's used to explain more about how it works together and how everything fits. And that's quite a beautiful way to look at something that a subject like mathematics that most of us tend to groan at.
Well, I think as well, personal transcendence, rather than rather than the transcendent reality being mathematical abstracted forces, computational forces, personal transcendence also means that we can make truth statements, and they actually have the possibility of being true. It's we're not just making relative truth statements that are always going to be relative to circumstance, because there is that interplay in our lived reality and our worldviews, sure, but there's actually, as Imago Dei, if we are made in the image of God, as theism would suggest, as most brands of theism, not even just Christianity, would suggest, then actually you can reason, you can deduce, you can discern, you can infer this is right and this is wrong, and that actually has the possibility of being true, because there is a transcendent moral lawgiver, there a moral determinant, arbiter, that actually gives measurable value to those statements or to those inferences. In a way that, if it's just mathematical abstract realities, doesn't.
Hey everybody, the astute observers of this podcast will notice a seamless audio edit at this point, where we add some more content to this argument, the mathematical argument in particular. Those who watch on YouTube might just notice just a slight clip, something being slightly different. I don't know, you'd have to really look closely to see some of those differences.
Nothing much different.
Yeah, not at all. Maybe like a haircut. No, nothing at all. I just love to make, whoever's editing, myself or Caleb, just to make it really difficult for either of us. That's always the intention.
Well, I just have to watch, so yeah, you do.
On that note, I'm going to land into a barrage of more content. I felt...
Take it away, nerd.
You got it, man. I felt that having watched over the mathematical argument in particular, I wanted to just add a couple more points. It was comparatively lighter then say some of the other arguments presented. So the reasons I had presented here, we've talked thus far about actually there seems to be an appearance of actually design, and it links quite nicely into the following argument on fine-tuning. But I thought I'd actually speak to actually these examples that we actually see of mathematics, even in early ancient cultures, like it's even in the world today. I don't know if you've ever looked at a fractal zoom online, Caleb. That's pretty amazing to look into.
Can't say I have. I will look at it now.
So fractals are basically geometric patterns that they are the way in which actually our universe actually arranges itself in geometric kind of symmetry. And we see like, these tessellating, transformational, kaleidoscopic designs where actually cells organize in this way, galaxies organize in this way. They're quite mesmerizing and not quite beautiful to look at. Fractal patterns are one of the ways we actually see not only geometric precision, but also kind of beauty being an evidence of design. Those of you familiar with the number phi in the Greek algebraic symbols, say like sigma and theta and the rest of it, phi actually represents the numbers that we know of in the Fibonacci sequence, named after a famous mathematician. And the Fibonacci sequence basically is a series of numbers representing a ratio, sequencing 1 and the next number being an increase of usually about 1.6. I forget the exact precise decimal number rounded off. But what's amazing about the Fibonacci sequence and the ratio in correlation to the next number in the sequence is that we see this ratio repeated in the golden triangle. We see this ratio repeated again and again and again throughout nature. It's in the nautilus shell, it's in the human ear, it's in the way waves crest, it's in the way galaxies spiral. We see this kind of ratio repeating over and over again. Like even if you actually look at your fingers of your hand, the actual ratio of, say, the top of your finger towards like the more elongated bones are 1 to 1.5. That finger to your entire hand is 1 to 1.5. That hand to your forearm is 1 to 1.5. Like you can see this kind of replicability in terms of actually, there's again geometric precision, but also a kind of actual logic, and there's an aesthetic element to it as well. So like, for example, we see the way actually plants crest and actually forms in spirals. It seems to be the best way, and actually sunlight and water can actually get to nutrients from the very top of the plant to the very base of the plant. So that's just one example, but the Fibonacci sequence is definitely an example of that precision and order referencing beauty. Another one I come across recently and having a bit of a look into sacred geometry. Have you looked at that at all, Caleb? Sacred geometry? Oh, muted, my friend.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I've not looked into it too much. I've heard of it in studies around high-level Freemasonry and occultism. It plays in with a lot with the work of a man named Michael Bertio. I may have mentioned him in a previous cast. He was a Chicago voodoo practitioner. More than just voodoo, though. He was also a social worker and a civil rights activist.
Right.
And he incorporated a lot of sacred geometry mixed with Eastern Orthodoxy, mixed with voodoo and voodoo, and astral projection. It's interesting, but I can't say I understand it too well. When I've read it, it's been pretty over my head, to be honest.
Yes, no, like I don't entirely understand it myself, but I'm just been doing a bit of research on it recently as it applies to mathematics in the universe. and all of which the ideas of which all those people we thoroughly and wholeheartedly endorse here at 2 or 3 Gathered. No. Discerningly, we take what we can affirm, what scripture
We only
says.
practice white magic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, I thought it would be useful here to actually mention some instances of sacred geometry which actually, again, evidence beauty, design, and also that precision that we'd expect of the kind of sophistication design. So Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio is one example, fractal patterns is another, but also Metatron's cube. I don't know if you've come across this before, Caleb, but Metatron's cube is
Transformers, eh?
exactly. I actually thought of that when I actually heard the name. I'll actually see if I can find you an image very quickly.
The all spark.
Metatron's cube is basically a shape in which we find, I'll share screen very briefly, this shape here, in which we actually find all of the Platonic solids, and they look like, so they look like so. We find actually these shapes by definition. In three-dimensional space, a Platonic solid is a regular convex polyhedron. It is constructed by congruent regular polygonal faces with the same number of faces meeting each vertex. And there's only 5 solids that actually meet this criteria, which are the 5 that you actually saw there. But this particular shape that I showed before, Metatron's cube, actually contains all these shapes, and these shapes are actually replicated 3D, three-dimensional, two-dimensional versions of them all throughout art, all throughout architecture in the ancient world. Without going too much down that rabbit hole, one other example of sacred geometry is the flower, and this is a particularly interesting one. The flower of life, or the tree of life, the egg of life, and we see actually that this is a design that's actually repeated in places all around the world, showing kind of a universality of astronomy, as maths is self-referencing, and that actually like probably evidencing that point again, that of commons ancestry, that there is actually a common shared mythology at one point. Will mention later on in this cast about how actually Michael Heiser and references other scholars in saying that it's more likely that actually monotheism came first before, and then pantheism later, not actually what's suggested otherwise by philosophers and historians, that no, pantheism was the first religions, and then actually monotheism developed later. But yeah, as it applies to actually the flower and the fruit of life, this is a particular design. We'll link a video in the description that shows this design. This design is actually found in art in Ireland, in Turkey, in Israel, in China, in Greece, in Germany, in India, in Iceland, in England, in Tibet, in Sweden, in Lapland, in the Yucatan. And the craziest thing about this design, these designs, is it is the same name in all of these places around the world, called the tree of life and called the flower of life. I think it's worth saying here that actually, I think like we see actually music, science, pure and applied math / art, often a pure discovery leads to an application sometime later. There are branches of mathematics called pure maths and applied mathematics, which I think actually, again, shows that actually the sophistication of this universe, this design, science has yielded similar discoveries, right? Where we realize something that's not until 300 years later that actually someone realizes, oh, this beautiful concept actually has a STEM component or a STEM application. Cox triangle, Coke or Cox, I forget the exact. It's a snowflake triangular image that is like infinite perimeter, basically, because there's triangles upon triangles. They realized that actually has a application to electromagnetism and how radio waves actually send frequencies in the last century.
as one example. But I think like all of these examples actually show, I guess, this idea that's been talked about in higher levels of philosophy about, was maths discovered or was it invented? Because if it was invented, just purely invented by man, why does man's ideas have real world application? I think to the theist, though, it's pretty self-evident. This isn't an issue for the theist, because we would suggest, well, again, all these instances evidence design. I would say here that the thing that, to wrap up and close on this mathematical argument, would perhaps be, it's been popularized by the likes of, say, Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson and some of their conversations more recently. Those Joe Rogan fans out there will definitely know about this. It's suggested, say, by some high-level scholars, non-theists, could this be an example of simulation theory? That is, that, incredibly intelligent, incredibly capable minds outside of this universe have actually essentially generated this universe. Is this universe actually a simulation? The popular notion is that the appearance of design means that reality is indeed a digital rendering by these transcendent programmers. I think it's interesting also, we mentioned like Chuck Missler a little bit earlier in this argument. He, along with actually a recent podcast with Neil deGrasse Tyson and Joe Rogan, or Neil deGrasse on Joe Rogan's podcast, they discuss the kind of specifics of measurement and actually how there's a precision where you can get to such precision where actually you can't ever be exact on the point of like, well, this is a millimeter, how much of a millimeter, how much of a nanometer, like you can never be exact on actually how much more, how much less something is divisible by. And Chuck Missler has advanced this idea before. Well, that would seem to suggest that on the most fundamental level, the universe has a binary nature. A binary meaning like, there are divisible parts. There is a part where this part begins and then that part begins. So some people suggest, well, does that then suggest also this idea that we are in some kind of simulation? And closing this on this, I would say, well, one, a transcendent programmer that's actually giving a digital rendering of the universe, that's beginning to sound a lot like theism. It's beginning to sound a lot like a god at that point. And secondly, that a theist believing the greater reality yet to be realized is actually an idea that coincides with Christian belief. So it could be suggested actually, if this reality currently is a simulation for what's to come, that actually a reality where heaven and earth are actually in the same domain, in the same terrain, in the same universe, heaven and earth actually colliding, overlapping, Venn diagramming, that is the eschatological vision of Scripture. Maybe then this reality is a simulation for the more heavenly reality that awaits us. And so again, that belief of actually this being a digital rendering of the universe, it doesn't have to actually contradict this belief.
Wonderful. Well put. Yeah. Thanks, you,
man. Have fun editing that.
I will indeed. It will be seamless.
Cool. So our next argument on the list is the fine-tuning argument. And I think you could probably see at this point, Caleb, there's kind of like there's a natural kind of coherency to these arguments and how they follow, but they also kind of build upon one another. Fine-tuning argument, as Craig often summarizes it, is if God did not exist, the further fine-tuning of everything that is to the degree of specificity that there is would not be possible. So, as well as building generally on our first 5 general theistic arguments, this links in quite nicely with our prior argument on mathematics and the applicability of mathematics and absolutes being an indication of design, an indication of actually sentient design. So I think I'm no scientist, expert mathematician, but there are 3 key points I think that actually, to me, illustrate these quite well to the general layman and are quite accessible to ourselves and our audience, and make sense to me in a way that I can explain, I think, reasonably well. So the first point I would say is with regards to what is known as the circumstellar habitable zones, or the colloquialism for it is known as the Goldilocks zones, where we see actually fine-tuning evident in these kind of cosmic close shaves, these cosmic close shaves. So this relates to like the exact proportions of gravity, the amounts of gases simultaneously occupying our atmosphere, the amount of water upon the Earth, the degree to upon which the Earth spins on its axis, the relative speed with which it does and circles around the sun, the distancing and position relative to the sun, the location of Earth relative to a local asteroid belt. This is in between, say, I believe it's us and Mars. Is that correct? You can maybe, remind me if that's the case, or if it's between Mars and Saturn. Even the fact that sufficiently larger planets with gravitational fields and their absorption of cataclysmic objects, like all of these things actually mean that actually Earth is so well positioned that actually we are positioned to avoid catastrophe, to avoid cataclysm, to actually we are safe, unbeknownst to all these circumstances which could actually just wipe out human existence at a moment's notice. All of these factors invisibly and implicitly guarantee our survival, and yet if any of them was off just by a fraction, life would be completely unsustainable. Like, we're talking about like trees bursting into flames or being crushed to death by our own mass, or if not, floating off into the atmosphere in extremes of heat, meaning we'd either boil or freeze to death, or suffocating because of slightly altered ratios of oxygen in the air. All very bleak, right? Like,
yeah, it's interesting, especially considering our earlier in our discussion, you mentioned how Lee Strobel had spoken to a scientist who, or actually a group of scientists. I remember reading this also in A Case for a Creator. I haven't read Case for the Resurrection, so that, or whichever one, Faith, I think it was, that you mentioned.
No, I haven't read Case for the Creator. I've read Case for Christ and Case for Faith.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Okay, yeah. So he mentions that they created a atmosphere of sorts.
That's right.
And it was mimicking the same amounts of nitrogen, helium, hydrogen, oxygen that were in the atmosphere back when they believed this primordial soup, so to speak, created, was sparked with electrical charges creating protein, or bursting forth protein, in the eyes of a non-causistic naturalist. They tried and tried and tried again, and like we spoke about, it only came up with protein killing chemicals. So the chances of that happening, even if we were to speak to, say, a theistic evolutionist, they would likely point to the fact that the statistical chances of that happening are just almost nil. Yeah.
Well, like this whole idea with that astrophysicists talk about with circumstellar habitable zones, it's basically like this range where a planet that can sustain life actually exists, that's not too hot or not too cold, but say just right, hence the Goldilocks term. It's these circumstances by which actually life can be sustained, like you're talking about. There's astronomical statistics compounding upon one another just to even get to these perfectly ideal circumstances. And like astrophysicists are actually aware of, there are, say, potentially habitable planets, right? Like, but they're very far and few between. Like, astrophysicists are actually scouring galaxies and finding actually just how few of these planets there are. And when you actually add some of these criteria, which we just listed, to that list, they become even less still, right? And I think this is actually supposed to be an invitation to deity. It's actually supposed to actually show us, like, well, doesn't this speak of design, that it's actually a god has made it just so based on our needs and requirements as humanity, as civilization? That seems to me that fine tuning would actually speak of his design and his intentionality. It's a bit of a hard one to get around by just pure chance, pure statistics. Yeah. So the second point that actually explores fine tuning for me is the idea of irreducible complexity. This was coined by the biologist Michael Behe, which summarized as a single system which is composed of several interacting parts, and when the removal of any one of those parts causes the system to cease functioning. So the example I actually remember from high school with this is for years biologists actually used to think that actually unicellular organisms, microorganisms, or just cellular organisms full stop, were actually quite basic things. And then they actually got them under the microscope and saw actually, wow, there's a level of complexity that like we can't even reproduce in our own, not even just actually in our own kind of technology, like scale like replicas in actually industry, like in automated factories that exist today. They can't replicate the kind of super computational forces that are just working on a microscopic scale and at such efficiency. It's mind-boggling. Like,
Yeah.
I want to just do a shout out to mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell right now.
Yeah.
As an example. But like the example that comes to mind for me is in school I was told about how the flagellum on, like, say, some unicellular organisms, it's like a little tail that, like, your sperm cell has, or different bacterial cells have, that it propels itself through fluid and through space. And how, well, that's quite a basic organism. Clearly an organism could just evolve that to actually get around. But you actually look at, say, on a microscopic scale, actually what goes into actually how the flagellum works. It's almost like mechanical engineering. Like, there's like a cog system where actually they kind of lock into each other and turn to actually allow the tail to actually move as it does. And so irreducible complexity, how this actually links back to fine tuning, what this means to say is, like, if you take away any of one of those cogs from how the flagellum works, it would cease to function. It doesn't work. So how then does macroevolution feature here? Macroevolution then talking about very small, minute changes, compoundingly adding up over time to actually produce a phenotypical, observable difference. It just doesn't work. I mean, mutation, if we talk about as being the means to that, it's almost always harmful. The time and chance involved is astronomical, and that we're aware of. No species jump or generation jump has ever been witnessed. Get out of here with the Darwin's finches. Like, that's, we could argue over that one for a whole podcast. It's like, no, it doesn't apply. Irreducible complexity means that sequential evolution then can't occur. So again, this seems to be, okay, what's the more reasonable explanation? Well, with fine-tuning on the weight of the other 5 arguments so far, makes sense. It would logically seem to suggest a creator. We're not getting to the who yet, but we're getting to a. Yeah. So the third point that relates to fine-tuning, as I would summarize it, is what is known as the laws of thermodynamics. So I mentioned before how science actually exists on a bedrock of laws and theories that actually make sense of the current existing body of scientific knowledge. This is the same with physics and biology and chemistry and other schools of science. But these laws kind of undergird a lot of actually what we know in the observable universe. So the first law, known as the law of conservation of energy, states that energy cannot be created or destroyed in an isolated system. The second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of any isolated system always increases. And the third law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of a system approaches a constant value as the temperature approaches absolute zero. So relating to fine-tuning, here's where I see some of these applications. Regarding the first law, the conservation of energy cannot be created or destroyed in an isolated system. Well, if there's a theistic view that actually there is a creator that transcends the known universe, theism would actually contend that a spiritual or heavenly reality actually exists outside the known universe, and therefore the universe is not isolated, and of which some parts are physical. Quantum theory can work alongside this law as well. Eschatologically, Scripture actually attests this idea that actually Christ in his physical body is reigning in heaven or from heaven right now, has not yet ascended to the throne of all creation. If we follow Revelation's, trajectory, but that would mean that actually some part of the heavenly realm is actually physical, not just spiritual. So therein, that actually makes us think energy cannot be created or destroyed in an isolated system. Clearly, a reality existing outside of this known reality can be entered into and entered out of. Certainly explains different instances in Scripture. So regarding the second law of thermodynamics, this is a bit of a reductionism, and come at me in the comments, all the astrophysicists and scientists who know better, but I've thought a good way of actually describing, entropy is kind of like life and death, like kind of the life energy and the death energy of things kind of decaying, actually naturally falling apart, randomness, chaos, as things actually come out of their form or their order. That's entropy, right? So miracles then seem to suspend the second law, that the entropy of any isolated system always increases. Miracles seem to reconvert energies or reverse the incremental entropy in the universe. But on the other point as well, like considering a naturalist suggestion of origins, evolution also inverts this law as well, because randomness is supposed to become increasingly more complex. And that doesn't make sense with the second law of thermodynamics. Some theists actually suggest theistic evolution here, with God as active agent, can actually subvert that requirement. So, that definitely gets around that. The third law states that, as I mentioned, entropy of a system approaches a constant value. This actually helps us date the universe, again, ascribing the idea of actually we have a point of reference. But then this can be subverted by the creator's interventions. And I actually wonder if there's an eschatological reference here. In 1 Peter, it actually talks about the universe ending in fire by kind of like a refinement process. And I've always thought, is that nuclear? Is that atomic? Is that talking about the eventual heat death of the universe as stars implode and then explode in supernovas? Like from the mathematics that astrophysicists have been able to work out, there will be an eventual heat death where actually things in the universe get so wide apart that there's actually every part of the universe will actually reach the same temperature, and that will be the eventual heat death of the universe, trillions of years into the future.
Which is a cheery thought.
Yeah, so helpful.
Yeah, especially without a creator.
Yeah, well, exactly. Have you seen Kurzegagt's material on any of this?
No.
I'll link a couple of those in the description too. Like, in a nutshell, Kurzegagt video, like this stuff, they're brilliant. Not theistic, but genius. Brilliant minds.
I've seen William Lane Craig's discovery and research into this as a high school student, and then realizing, okay, it's all for nothing without Christ. But we'll, I'm sure, cover a little bit of that.
So with regards to what we're talking about with the fine-tuning, these points kind of illustrate it to me. Like, there are other areas we could talk to, but first point, the circumstellar habitable zones, or the Goldilocks zone. Second point, talking about irreducible complexity, and the third point, talking about the laws of thermodynamics. These seem to make better sense in a theistic worldview. Like, I'm no scientist, as I mentioned, but I'm of the mind that Occam's razor applies when considering logical consistency, that the simpler explanations should be more probable, and you shouldn't actually need complex scientific arguments suggest the opposing atheistic alternative, when the weight of evidence so far supports so strongly a general view of the theism. However, two also are scientific realities that relate here and apply. Like, we could actually mention what of quantum theory, right? Some, atheistic philosophers, scientists are actually kind of holding out, well, this could make sense of things, alongside like modal universes. Again, we actually explored a little bit of that prior in the cast, that actually says, well, that doesn't actually really make sense either, given properly basic beliefs. But again, I would say, like, things appearing and disappearing out of existence alongside digital bosons and quarks, existing numerous quantum states, this suggests other realities, and the theist has no problem with embracing this. If there's a other reality, if there's a spiritual reality that's, not physical, or partially physical, or altogether physical, other dimensions, if you were. Again, no problem for the theist. And another reality that kind of actually ought to be considered here is actually the presence of antimatter and dark matter in the universe. Astrophysicists actually, in looking throughout the galaxy, they've found the presence of this giant masses of stuff, which is not visible to the naked eye, and yet gravity acts upon it. And they estimate that as much as 85%, I'm sure it's more, I've seen other estimates which are more, 85% of the actual known universe is filled with this dark matter, the stuff that actually is being acted upon but can't be seen. And antimatter as well. So, like, antimatter is the kind of the constant, or the opposite of, say, said matter. Like, there are negatively charged molecules, which are kind of the opposite of like any said molecule that we have. And antimatter should, by its sheer presence, actually annihilate things. It should actually just, antimatter came in presence and came in touch with a atom of normal matter. It should actually cause like a nuclear style reaction by presence. But the vacuum of space could account for this actually not being the case. That actually there's huge vast distances where these other atoms don't come in contact with one another. Asymmetry seems to be a factor here, and why it doesn't. The fact that actually there is far, 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 far more positively charged molecules than there are negatively charged molecules. And dark matter, then, by its nature, should actually disrupt universal constants. Should actually, cause issues to, say, the law of gravity acting throughout the universe. But in both these instances, I'm reminded of a verse in Colossians, verse 17. Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, which starts with this description of Jesus, which sounds like emperor worship. And it's like, we read it, just kind of gloss over the details, but anyone who would have read it contextually at the time would have thought, like, this is a propaganda. This is basically like a sheer, strike at the, Caesar worship, because the way they're talking about Christ is the way he would have been actually talked about, typically at the time. And you have this verse in 1 verse 17, which talks about in him, Christ, all things hold together. And I always wonder, actually, the presence of antimatter and dark matter, these things that actually should exist and should actually, we don't understand why, shouldn't exist. And we don't understand actually why they don't actually undo things by their sheer nature and by their sheer presence. I would ask the question, does this better suit materialism, or does this better suit theism? Does this better suit a fine-tuning argument, which actually, okay, we don't understand why they're there, but perhaps we don't understand yet, and it's actually an attestation to the balance of said forces. Actually, is an invitation to glory, because actually God is actually balancing these forces and uses them with intent and with purpose. I'm not one for God of the gaps theories, but I feel like this has some weight here.
Hey, twos and threes, just as mentioned earlier, we split this into 3 parts as opposed to 2. So here we've had the intentionality argument, the mathematical, followed finally by the fine-tuning argument. Join us in part 3 for our more Christian-specific arguments for theism.